Recording in progress.
So we are reading the mind region, and so we are on the spectrum of ego and its role. So this ego, I mean, if you, especially when it comes to uh, reading Indian scriptures, you will hear this word ego time and again. But somehow this ego has become the villain, you know. But without the ego, there is no progress, because the ego is the one which is basically initially it pushes us to do something, because inherently we try to protect this ego identity. See, why are we scared of death? Because our identity with this body will be annihilated, diminished with the death. So we become very protective of this identity, body identity. See, ego is nothing but the identity which we have developed over a period of time. So the whole aspect of spirituality, like I was saying, is to develop another state of identity with this inner essence, the higher self. So when it connects with this inner essence, when it identifies with that inner essence, all external identities get dropped. If I have to speak from a scripture language, the prakriti in us drops. Means that which is associated with all this external world drops. Then the refinement of the ego begins, and it identifies with this higher essence, self, soul. You can call it the supreme soul or the Paramatman. So that's the whole idea. So now this has the spectrum we spoke about in length uh, last week, right? So I kind of give this example time and again. What this spectrum means, correct? So we in heartfulness terms we talk about expansion of consciousness. So because as the consciousness is expanding, our spectrum of that consciousness increase, and similarly the ego also has the spectrum. When this identification goes to the higher, it doesn't mean we have to leave the lower spectrum. See, this is also misunderstood. See, some of the people who kind of practice into this, they say, okay, I am not this body, I am not this mind, I am not. So there is the reason this I am not this body doesn't mean I lose this body. I mean, even though I lose the identity of the body, doesn't mean, if I get cough, if I get, like a cold, I don't suffer physically. It doesn't mean that. But sometimes we take it to an extreme, saying that if I have cold or if I have headache, this some of these so-called saints, Swamijis ask, "Oh, who has the headache?" Right? It's very. Sometimes I find it very funny. Uh, you are not this body, so means that your head is having a headache. So that does that mean I should ignore that headache, right? Or I should not take a Tylenol or ibuprofen to get rid of that headache? It's not like that. So we take it to the extreme. The simple idea is that just don't stop with your body identity, go beyond your body identity. That's all it means. You are not this body doesn't mean that you lose all the sensations of the body, you know? So it's like that. But in an unrefined state, the ego wreaks havoc, creating fear, insecurity, anger, and so on. So all the emotions we go through is only because of this identity of the ego. So we need to recognize that. But even if you recognize it, you cannot do anything about it. See, the problem is information stops at the level of information only. So this is I mean, the pattern is like this, the experience creates the knowledge, knowledge creates the information. You cannot take the information and think that you are experiencing it. You see, a lot of times we take the information and we sort of assume that we are experiencing that information. We are not experiencing it, we are only processing that information. Correct? So yesterday there is a one session, and I was asked to share my experience about meditation. I said, I can share my experience, but each individual go through their own experience in this journey. Suppose if you have an ability to talk to a soul, lack of a better word, who is going to take birth as human, and if the soul would have to inquire people, how is this like being a human? What feedback can you give? What feedback can you give possibly? So, if I share my journey with this heartfulness or my experiences, it doesn't mean anything to anybody, literally. It doesn't mean you have to go through the same experience. Each individual goes through their own journey. If I read about Babuji's experience about this meditation, Lalaji's experience, would it change my life? It might create interest in me to take up spirituality. But I have to take up this journey and I have to find my own experience. And that experience is exclusively to belongs to me. That doesn't mean anyone else or my wife or my son who takes up this practice will go through that experience. Because that ego, based on the impressions, identifying, experiencing this life as per each individual's impressions. We are all made the same. Why? But we think different, we approach life differently, we experience life differently because this ego with the samskaras, impressions, going through its own experience. That becomes very unique to each individual. So the idea of self improvement comes from the ego because ego cannot be satisfied with its identity. It has to make it refined. The innate quality of the ego is as much as it identifies it, as much as it wants to protect its identity, it wants to grow from that identity, right? Suppose I'm I'm like a medium income earning guy. My ambition of life is always to grow into a higher income guy, right? So I'm always trying to improve in everything I know. We are trying to improve in our knowledge about this world, science, everything, so in some way or the other, we are investing ourselves to improve. And this goes on until death. But for all this good, we allow the ego to blow up and take our lives. That's where it becomes a problem. A dominant ego becomes unreceptive to the mind's inspirations. It's as if the mind is shut out from providing any guidance. So the powerful discriminatory ability of intellect remains unused. It's very important to understand this. I'll read it out again. A dominant ego becomes unreceptive to the mind's inspirations. It's as if the mind is shut out from providing any guidance. The powerful discriminatory ability of the intellect remains unused. So that's why, like, again, the same thing. Somebody asked me this question about opening our heart. I said our heart is always open. There are no shutters on our heart. But this ego identity, becomes very unreceptive. When it becomes unreceptive, we lose that discernment ability. What is discerning here? Discriminatory abilities is always by intellect. This is another point. Intellect's ability is only to tell you right versus wrong, black versus white. It's always discriminating. It's always finding things with the contrast. That's where the intellect stops. Just because I have a higher intellect doesn't mean I have a better memory. Intellect is only to discriminate things, discern. That's all. That's where the level of intellect stops. But without that intellect, we cannot make right decisions. So without that intellect being intact, we cannot make right decisions. But if your ego is dominating, then it blinds everything. That's why the refining of the ego becomes very important, especially in spiritual aspect of life. So thinking becomes biased and unclear. So in such a state where the ego has taken over, it assumes the form of arrogance and it decays self-improvement. Okay. So this is not exactly arrogance. I would say it takes the form of ignorance. It doesn't want to accept anything. So the grasping ability sort of shuts down. That's why sometimes, to me, it makes a very logical sense. And I can tell other person, hey, you're doing wrong. I can see what the other person is doing wrong or right. But when it comes to myself, I'm not able to do that discernment, whether I am doing right or wrong. I assume I am doing right, whatever I am doing, right? So why I'm not able to see my mistakes or my incapabilities in life, whereas I'm able to see everybody else. Reason my ego is dominating me. It's not allowing me to see what I am truly. Correct? So this arrogance puts you in a make-believe world where you believe yourself to be perfect, thereby not acknowledging any weakness. Arrogance prevents self introspection and remain deaf. The voice of deaf to the voice of conscience. How can you improve then? Think of an argument where all you wanted was to dominate the other person. In such interactions, ego shuts down all other faculties. All ego wants is dominance, no matter at what cost. The mind is no longer relevant, and the intellect is used for devious means. In such a state, your consciousness contracts and the entire system feels heavy. Not to mention the samskara chain reaction triggered across the heart chakras. So, internally, the ego, once it is dominating, all your samskaras comes to they start manifesting because now they gain the power. However, if properly used, the ego becomes an alchemic ingredient in your evolution. So after all, it is the ego that entices us to succeed in our work. By competing against others, you fall victim to insecurity and arrogance. By competing with yourself, you avoid these pitfalls and improve. So, without the motivation of the ego, we would timidly accept our imperfections and weaknesses and give up on this goal of self improvement entirely. So, it is so important. This ego identification pretty much plays, a role in every aspect of life. Without this ego motivated, we cannot take up any task. We give up. Suppose if I'm even I've seen, some of the terminally ill patients. I mean, it is inevitable that at that point the death is inevitable, but they continue to live longer if their ego is motivated to live longer. They almost, their life shortens even at the terminal state if they give up. You see that ego plays such an important role in everything we do, from a small thing to a big thing. So that's why, again, I kind of repeat, there is so much emphasis on the refinement of the ego. And one more thing, if one thinks that they can get rid of the ego completely, uh, that statement is not correct. In some of the ideologies, they make the ego the biggest villain and say, oh, we must not have any ego. If you don't have any ego, you become a vegetable. That identity is very, very important. And ego is the one which is driving the life. Even if you, according to the spirituality, we are going to read in spiritual anatomy, when ego almost becomes zero, sublime. So there is no zero, it is almost tending towards it. When it becomes totally sublime, it becomes totally surrendered to the higher essence. But even that act of surrender requires that sublime ego. Without that, it is not possible. Okay. So I think we will be completing this in our next session. Uh, so the pursuit of excellence initially because of ego, and later because of love endows you with the clarity and take stock of where you are and benchmark yourself against highest ideal. So the ego falls into the right place when you experience something higher and when you have the discernment to recognize as it as such. Then the power of ego works to uplift you towards the higher. So then when ego no longer serves itself, it starts applying itself to the work at hand. So let us look at the ego, ego as a spectrum. To brush your teeth, you may be, so maybe your ego needs to be at 3%. To give a speech in front of 10,000 people, perhaps your ego needs to be at 80%. But your ego stays at 80% after the speech, it now becomes a problem. So your ego no longer matches your level of activity. So here, the ego is synonymous to the conscious state, like we were discussing. Even the conscious state is a spectrum. So it is adjusting according to your activity. So ego gets refined, more and more refined when we are in state of meditation, when we are in state of remembrance. Because to remember that conscious spectrum has to go very high. To be in state of in a meditative state, the conscious spectrum has to go very high. But if I am watching a movie, it doesn't require that conscious spectrum, right? So that's why it is readjusting itself. No, we are not saying, okay, now my ego has to go to 80% because I am giving a public talk. No, not like that. So it adjusts automatically. But what is basically implying is that the more spectrum you have access to, the more refined the ego becomes. Here we are talking about in infinite spectrum, right? So sometimes we have to be stubborn about something, sometimes we have to be flexible about something. So that is why the ego is backed by the intellect. Ego is also backed by the wisdom, the buddhi. So both are required for ego to function properly. But in turn, ego can dominate both. So when ego becomes flexible, it allows the intellect and the wisdom to guide it. But if it wants to dominate, it will not allow anything to guide. There's an example from Mahabharata story. The Lord Krishna goes to this guy, Duryodhana, says, hey, all that you are doing is creating a war and loss of life. Why, why don't you yield? He says, I understand what is right, what is wrong, but my ego is not permitting. I mean, at least he was conscious that his ego is not permitting. So it becomes an inevitable war in the story, correct? So that's why it is very essential for us to keep this ego in check, refine and refine. So that's the purpose of this spiritual practice. Okay. I'll stop here for any comments, questions, observations. Then we can get into meditation.